Hi, I'm Dale Tremondy, and among other things, I'm known as Father Time to Babs & Brothers Company, and I'd like to share a few minutes with you this morning reviewing the history of Babs & Brothers. Before I start, though, I think there's a little prologue that I certainly have to introduce, and that is because of the magnificent wall itself. This wall was developed by a man by the name of Frank Hendren, who came to Chicago from the Kansas City Star in Kansas City, Missouri. When Frank Hendren came to Chicago, a partner of his went to the West Coast, and his name was Walt Disney. There was a genius with both of them, and I don't know whether Frank Hendren rubbed off on Walt Disney or vice versa, but certainly as you look at this wall and some of the artwork of Frank Hendren, you'll see there's Walt Disney and him or vice versa. The history of Babson really started when Henry, Fred, and Gus, the three brothers, literally came from Seward, Nebraska to Chicago area, and it started when Henry Babson came to Chicago in 1893. It really all started when Henry Babson came to Chicago in 1893 when he met Thomas Edison at the First World's Fair. At that time, they developed a relationship, and Henry Babson started selling the Thomas Edison phonograph. He became so successful, he then brought in his brothers, and in 1906 they incorporated. And they started really with the Edison phonograph, but then progressed and started selling suits and shoes and watches. They named it the Burlington watch, and the reason they called it the Burlington is because the office was located adjacent to the Burlington Railroad. It had railroad approval on it, and although it was mass-produced, it still had the design capabilities of being approved for railroad usage. They did very well with the watches, and they did very well with the suits and the shoes, and with records and everything else. And another interesting story about Henry Babson is that he had a friend going to Europe, and he suggested that if he would audition some people over there, and if he ran across anybody who really had a great voice, Henry would be more than willing to pay for his passage. And as a result of that, Henry Babson was instrumental in bringing over Enrico Caruso. So they had suits and shoes and watches, and they got started in agriculture by starting to sell the old tan harnesses, and that was their first venture into agriculture, even though they had this mail order business going. From the old tan harness, they then progressed and moved into another phase of agriculture, and that would be dairying, by importing the Malott cream separator from Belgium. Henry Babson had the exclusive distributor for the entire U.S. And in the early 1900s, of course, they didn't have refrigeration on dairy farms, and so a lot of milk had to be separated, and the Malott cream separator gained much acceptance in the United States. I think on the entire wall here, I think part of the marketing genius of Henry Babson basically is encased in this picture, because this is the only picture of a moving billboard I've seen from New York to Chicago. How Henry got this handled, I don't know, but he had this train that came from New York to Chicago, and he had emblazoned on every train car a Malott separator sign. Now, as you know and as I know, advertising is not allowed on trains, and how he got this handled, I don't know. He used it in a lot of advertising copy, and to me it's the only picture I've really seen of a train having advertising copy on it, and I think it shows a little bit of the genius of Henry. And I'm also not so sure that we sold that many Malott cream separators from the very beginning of the distributorship to the end of it. Another interesting story is the Malott sign up there. I happen to be in a town called Oberlin, Kansas, which is fairly close to the Oklahoma and Colorado border, and I was taking depositions, and I happened to be smoking at that time. I ran out of cigarettes at 5 o'clock in the evening. The front door of the courthouse was closed, and so I walked out the back door of the courthouse to get some cigarettes, and when I did, that sign, that metal sign, was nailed to a wooden building adjacent to the alley of the courthouse. So when we got through taking those depositions that evening, I acquired that sign and brought it to Babson Brothers Company. On the back of the sign is the date and exactly what all happened. Nonetheless, it's the only sign that we know of that is in existence. As a result of the success of the Malott cream separator, Babson then elected to build their own milking machine, and they called it the Pine Tree Milker. The reason they called it the Pine Tree is because Fred Babson had a Guernsey farm in Riverside, Illinois, and so they named it the Pine Tree Milker. It was a long tube milker where the unit sat on the floor. It had a long hose with a claw that, of course, would be attached to the cow. And it frankly was no better or no worse than any other milking machine out there. And although Babson Brothers recognized it was a good milking machine when they first sold it, they found out over a period of time, as a result of the harsh environment that exists on a dairy farm, a lot of times it lost its efficiency. But anyway, they sold a lot of them, especially during the First World War. But as they sold these units, they found out that they were getting complaints from a lot of regulatory people because the quality of milk was going south. Bacteria counts were going up, and part of the reason was is they couldn't keep the units clean. Because of the long hoses, sometimes 6 and 8 feet long, and because of the only detergents available on the farm was really lye soap, certainly not the chemicals that we know today, bacteria counts were going up and they were not very easy to clean. On top of that, the milker units lost efficiency because of the harsh environment that existed at the dairy. As a result of that, they limped along during the war years, and they found out after the war that a lot of these milking machines that initially had been sold were put up on the shelf because of not working right, and of course because they couldn't be kept clean. At the same time, in about 1920 or 1922, a man by the name of Herbie McCornack from Elgin, Illinois, walked into the office one day, and he talked to Henry Babson and George Mather, the sales manager, and said he had a new way of milking cows. And the contraption he literally brought into the office was made out of a roasting pan. They listened to the story, and even though they didn't know whether it would milk cows, the one thing that appealed to Henry Babson and to George Mather is that it was easy to clean. Instead of 8 feet of hose that had to be cleaned here, we now only get 8 inches of rubber in the inflation. And so based on the concept of easy to clean, they bought the patent rights. Then when they took it out and they started really milking with the unit, they found out it just milked the socks off of any other unit. Part of the reason we now know was because of the vacuum and stability that was in the pail itself. The reason they called it the surge is because this unit was going to be suspended on a surcingle strap that was hanging on the belly of a cow. And as a result of the milk flowing into the pail, that caused a surging action that caused the unit to rock back and forth on the surcingle, and that's how they got the name surge. They introduced the surge in 1923, 1924, and by 1940 we had 40% of the market. The reason we had 40% of the market was really threefold. Number one, it was easy to clean. Number two, it just milked the socks off of any other unit. But they also, Henry Babson and the brothers, also recognized that when they initially sold this unit, it lost efficiency. And so when they sold the surge unit, they incorporated a service program, and they guaranteed that surge user that when he would buy a surge bucket milker, he would have a surge user call on that farm at least once a year to make sure it's operating at peak operating efficiency. So they developed a service program. By 1940, we had 40% of the market. In 1941, of course, the war broke out. We couldn't get materials, and of course, we limped along building as many as we could. We tried to build it out of plastic. It didn't work. Certainly today we could do so, but the plastics that were available at that time, we used them for fair displays and for demonstrations, but they certainly wouldn't hold up under the environment of a dairy farm. This kind of shows you an evolution of the pulsation that exists on bucket milkers and on any milking machine. And an interesting story here is, even though we have an evolution, this second unit here, this pulsator here, happens to be pulsator number 1. We found it in Michigan. It was working on a farm. We traded it for a new pulsator and some other equipment that we gave that man. It was working the day we brought it in. We've never cleaned it, and that pulsator is on the wall, and that's number 1, the first surge unit, that pulsator that was ever sold. Another interesting story with the surge milker is that when we built the millionth unit, we decided, and here's some of the marketing ploys that you sometimes have great ideas that don't necessarily work. When we built the millionth unit, we decided we're going to gold plate it. After it was gold plated, that's exactly what it looked like. It looked gold plated. We never used it. That happens to be the lid. This pulsator also was gold plated, but when we cleaned the wall a few years ago, the gold literally rubbed off of it. After the war, of course, we geared up, and by 1950, we got 53.4% of the U.S. market. In 1955, the year our patents ran out, we had 76% of the bucket milker business. One of the things that Babson also did during the war years is that, if you'll recall, we initially told all dairymen that they would have a surge dealer call on them once a year. Of course, during the war, our good surge dealers also went to war. We didn't have the manpower, nor did we have the gas to go on a lot of these farms. And so during the war years, we limped along and we sent letters to surge users and said, hey, we can't come to your farm, but if you'll bring your equipment to Waterloo or to Janesville or to Rockford or wherever it might be on such and such a day, we'll be there and we'll try to maintain your equipment. And so that's how we maintained the equipment during the war years. And of course, after the war, we geared up again.